The skeletal Colts trembled in their metal cage as Jackson Hargrove locked eyes with them, their desperate gazes piercing straight through the armor he'd built around his heart since the war. Standing tall against the whispers and mockery of the auction crowd, he felt 13 years of solitude crack wide open as the words escaped his lips with unexpected certainty. "I'll take them all." Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty main street of Cottonwood Springs, baking the weathered wooden buildings and casting harsh shadows across the packed dirt road. Jackson Hargrove pulled his hat lower, shielding his eyes from the glare as he dismounted his chestnut mare in front of the general store. The town was busier than usual, clusters of men in dusty hats and worn boots gathering in small groups, their conversations a low murmur beneath the occasional whinny of horses and creak of wagon wheels. "Auction day," Jackson muttered to himself, securing his horse to the hitching post. He hadn't planned on attending, but the supplies he needed couldn't wait another week. His ranch, Broken Spoke, lay 20 miles outside of town, too far to make the journey twice in short succession. Jackson's weathered face, framed by a salt and pepper beard grown more salt than pepper over recent years, betrayed little emotion as he surveyed the crowd. At 53, he'd seen his share of hardships on the frontier: drought, blizzards, cattle disease, and the slow but steady encroachment of the railroad bringing changes he wasn't always fond of. But he'd survived, unlike many who'd arrived with grand dreams only to be broken by the harsh realities of Western life. "Hargrove? Didn't expect to see you in town today." Sheriff Mills approached, his badge catching the sunlight. Jackson nodded in greeting. "Just need supplies, Tom. Not looking to socialize." The sheriff chuckled. "Same as always. Well, if you're here, you might want to know they're auctioning off the Carlton place. Old man died last month, no family to speak of." This caught Jackson's attention. Carlton's small ranch bordered his own property to the east. "Who's looking to buy?" "Westland Rail's got an agent here looking to expand the depot area, I reckon." Mills frowned. "Times are changing, Jackson." "Not all change is progress," Jackson replied, his voice low and graveled from years of trail dust and the occasional whiskey. After purchasing his supplies and arranging for delivery, curiosity drew Jackson toward the auction happening at the edge of town. He told himself he was just gathering information about who might become his neighbor, but something else pulled him forward. A sense that the land he'd fought for, the life he'd built, was increasingly endangered by men in suits who saw the West as nothing but numbers in a ledger. The auction was being held in the open area beside Thompson's livery stable. A crowd had gathered, mostly locals, but Jackson immediately spotted the rail company man, perfectly pressed suit, shiny boots that had never known real work, and a look of smug certainty that made Jackson's jaw tighten. As he approached, Jackson noticed something that made him pause. Off to the side of the main auction area stood a metal livestock pen, and inside were two of the sorriest-looking colts he'd ever seen. Black as midnight, their ribs clearly visible beneath dull coats, they huddled together in the corner of the cage. Their eyes, large and liquid, held a wariness that spoke of neglect, perhaps even cruelty. "Those Carlton's horses?" Jackson asked a man standing nearby. "Nah," the man replied, spitting tobacco juice into the dust. "Those belong to Wilson, that gambler who skipped town owing everybody money. Sheriff seized him for debts, going to auction them after the Carlton place sells." Jackson moved closer to the pen, something tightening in his chest. He'd always had a soft spot for horses, understanding them better than people most days. These young colts, barely a year old if he had to guess, were in deplorable condition, but he could see good lines beneath the neglect. With proper care, they might amount to something. The auctioneer's voice rose above the crowd as he began the bidding for the Carlton ranch. Jackson lingered by the horse pen, watching as the two colts shifted nervously at the noise and commotion. One of them, slightly larger, positioned himself protectively in front of the smaller colt. Brothers, Jackson surmised, from the same mare, showing a loyalty that many humans would do well to learn from. $500. Do I hear $550? The auctioneer called, his voice carrying across the gathered crowd. Jackson turned his attention back to the land auction, listening as the price climbed steadily higher. The railroad agent bid with casual flicks of his hand, as though the amounts meant nothing, which to his employers, they likely didn't. A few local ranchers tried to keep pace, but one by one they dropped out as the price exceeded what working cattlemen could justify. Sold to Northern Westland Railway for $875. The auctioneer's gavel came down with a finality that felt to Jackson like a nail being driven into a coffin. Another piece of ranching country lost to the advancing tide of progress. The crowd shifted, some dispersing while others moved closer as the auctioneer directed attention to the horse pen. Next up, we have 2 yearling colts being sold for debt settlement. These animals are available as is, no guarantees. The man's voice held no special enthusiasm. These weren't prize stock, just assets to be liquidated. Jackson's eyes narrowed as he studied the colts more carefully. Despite their poor condition, he could see intelligence in their eyes. The way they moved, even in their weakened state, suggested good conformation underneath. The protective one met Jackson's gaze briefly, a flicker of something, defiance perhaps, visible even through fear. "We'll start the bidding at $10 for the pair," the auctioneer announced. A murmur ran through the crowd. Even at such a low price, few seemed interested in taking on such obviously neglected animals. They represented work, expense, and uncertainty, with no guarantee they'd survive, let alone become useful. $10, called a voice from the back. Jackson recognized Harlan Webb, the local tanner. Webb wasn't known for his kindness to animals, and the thought of these colts ending up as hides turned Jackson's stomach. 15, countered another voice. Peterson, who ran the freight company. He'd work the horses to death if they survived at all. Jackson found himself stepping forward before he'd made a conscious decision. 20, he called, his deep voice carrying across the suddenly quiet crowd. People turned to look. Jackson Hargrove rarely participated in town events, let alone auctions. $20, the auctioneer repeated, seemingly pleased to have generated any interest at all. Do I hear 25? 25, Webb called, eyeing Jackson with curiosity. Jackson kept his expression neutral, though inwardly he was calculating quickly. He didn't need more horses. His ranch was already operating on tight margins after the harsh winter. But something about these two colts, their loyalty to each other, their quiet dignity even in their reduced circumstances, resonated with him. 30, Jackson countered. The bidding continued, pushing past what anyone would consider reasonable for horses in such condition. The crowd watched with increasing interest as the price climbed, confusion evident on many faces. These weren't prime stock. They were half-starved yearlings of questionable background. $50, Peterson said firmly, giving Jackson a challenging look that said he wouldn't go higher for such questionable investments. Jackson took a deep breath, stepped forward until he stood directly before the pen, and looked at the two frightened colts who stared back with a mixture of fear and what he could only interpret as hope. "I'll take them all," he announced clearly, his voice cutting through the murmurs of the crowd. $100. A stunned silence fell over the crowd. $100 for 2 half-dead colts was beyond foolish. It was the kind of decision that made people question a man's sanity. The auctioneer recovered first, his practiced voice hiding any surprise he might have felt. $100 from Mr. Hargrove. Do I hear 110? No one spoke. Webb and Peterson exchanged glances, clearly considering Jackson a fool for bidding so high on such questionable prospects. Going once, going twice. The auctioneer paused, scanning the crowd hopefully before bringing down his gavel with a sharp crack. Sold to Jackson Hargrove for $100. As the crowd began to disperse, murmurs followed Jackson like persistent flies. He ignored them, approaching the pen where the Colts watched him warily. The protective one shifted, placing himself more firmly in front of his smaller companion. Jackson respected that instinct. Loyalty was rare enough in this world. "You overpaid by about $90, Hargrove," Sheriff Mills said, appearing beside him. "Those two might not make it through the week." Jackson reached into his vest pocket and withdrew a folded wad of bills, counting out the agreed sum. "Maybe so, but they deserve a chance." "Your money, your business," Mills shrugged, accepting the payment. "I'll tell Turner to release them to you. Got a way to transport them?" Jackson nodded. "My wagon's behind the general store. I'll bring it around." As the sheriff walked away, Jackson approached the pen slowly, making no sudden movements. He kept his voice low, almost a murmur, as he addressed the Colts. "Easy now. Nobody's going to hurt you anymore." The larger Colt's ears flicked forward, registering Jackson's voice while his dark eyes remained suspicious. The smaller one peered around his brother, curiosity momentarily overcoming fear. Jackson stood there quietly, letting them get accustomed to his presence. He'd broken enough horses to know that trust couldn't be rushed. These two had clearly known more cruelty than kindness in their young lives. It would take time to undo that damage, if it could be undone at all. Turner, the livery stable owner, approached with keys jangling in his hand. "You sure about this, Hargrove? These nags ain't worth feeding." "I'll be the judge of that," Jackson replied evenly. Turner snorted, but unlocked the pen. "Your funeral. Doubt they'll even make it back to your place." Jackson didn't dignify the comment with a response. Instead, he produced 2 lengths of rope from his pocket and fashioned simple halters. With slow, deliberate movements, he approached the Colts, speaking softly all the while. "Easy now, that's right. Nobody's rushing you." The larger Colt snorted, pawing the ground nervously, but didn't bolt as Jackson slipped the makeshift halter over his head. The smaller one trembled but allowed the same treatment, perhaps taking cues from his brother. "Good boys," Jackson murmured. "That's right." By the time he had retrieved his wagon and brought it around to the livery stable, a small crowd of onlookers had gathered, curiosity drawing them to witness what many considered a fool's errand. Jackson ignored their stares, focusing instead on coaxing the Colts from the pen. The larger Colt balked at first, pulling back against the rope. Jackson didn't force him, simply maintaining gentle pressure and speaking in the same low, reassuring tone. Eventually, the Colt took one hesitant step forward, then another. His smaller brother followed, still trembling but seemingly unwilling to be separated. Getting them into the wagon proved another challenge. Jackson had lined the bed with fresh hay, a luxury given its scarcity this year, but the Colts regarded the wooden structure with obvious suspicion. "They ain't never been in a wagon," observed one onlooker. "Probably gonna break their fool necks trying." Again, Jackson ignored the commentary. He reached into his pocket and produced 2 withered apple halves he'd been saving for his own horse. The sweet scent caught the smaller Colt's attention immediately, his nostrils flaring. Jackson held the treat out, not moving toward the Colt, but waiting patiently. After a moment's hesitation, hunger overcame fear. The smaller Colt took a tentative step toward the wagon, then another. His brother followed protectively, watching Jackson with wary intensity. When the smaller Colt stretched his neck to take the apple piece, Jackson gently stroked his nose. The first kind touch these animals had likely known in months. "That's it. Easy now." With remarkable patience, Jackson coaxed first one Colt, then the other into the wagon. He secured them with loose leads that would prevent jumping out but not cause panic, then covered them with a light blanket to shield their weakened bodies from the afternoon sun. As he climbed onto the wagon seat and took up the reins of his own horse, now hitched to pull it, Sheriff Mills approached once more. "Those railmen were asking about you," he said quietly, "wondering if you might be interested in selling some of your water rights." Jackson's expression hardened. "My land's not for sale, not in pieces, not as a whole." "Thought as much," Mills nodded. "Just figured you should know they're asking. They seem to think everyone has a price." "Then they don't know me," Jackson replied, flicking the reins to set his horse in motion. The wagon creaked as it began its journey out of town. Jackson didn't look back at the curious onlookers, nor did he acknowledge the railroad agent watching from the hotel porch. His focus remained on the road ahead and the fragile cargo he now carried. The 20 miles back to Broken Spoke would take the better part of the day at the careful pace he needed to maintain. The Colts would require immediate attention upon arrival, feed, water, and shelter adapted to their weakened condition. There was no guarantee they would survive, despite his efforts. As the town receded behind him, Jackson allowed himself to consider the impulse that had driven him to such an uncharacteristic act. He was not a sentimental man. Life on the frontier didn't allow for excess emotion. Yet something about those two Colts, their obvious bond, their quiet dignity even in suffering, had spoken to something deep within him. Perhaps it was because he recognized their struggle. The West was changing around him, the open ranges giving way to railroad tracks and fenced properties. Men like him, men who valued independence and lived by an older code, were becoming as endangered as the buffalo that once roamed freely across the plains. "We're survivors, the three of us," he murmured, glancing back at his new charges. "This world may not want our kind anymore, but we're not finished yet." The smaller Colt nickered softly in response, as if understanding the sentiment, if not the words themselves. For the first time that day, Jackson allowed himself a slight smile. It would be a long road to recovery for these animals, but he'd never been one to shy away from difficult tasks. The wagon continued eastward, a solitary silhouette against the vast, unforgiving landscape that had shaped Jackson Hargrove and would now determine whether his act of mercy would prove foolish or wise. The road to Broken Spoke Ranch stretched before Jackson like a weathered leather belt across the rugged landscape. The afternoon sun beat down relentlessly, and he kept a careful eye on the Colts in the wagon bed, stopping periodically to offer them water from his canteen. The smaller one drank eagerly, though the larger remained wary, accepting only after his brother had tested the offering. "Stubborn," Jackson murmured with grudging respect. "Good quality in these parts." As the wagon rolled across the open range, Jackson's thoughts turned to what awaited them at the ranch. His operation wasn't large, about 60 head of cattle, 4 working horses, and a handful of chickens that his housekeeper Martha insisted on keeping. It was modest by some standards, but Jackson had built it himself after returning from the war with nothing but scars, nightmares, and a determination to carve out something that belonged solely to him. He'd never married, never seen the point of bringing a woman into the hard-scrabble existence he'd chosen. His only regular human contact came from Martha, a widow in her 60s who rode out from town twice a week to cook, clean, and lecture him about his solitary ways, and Luis, the young Mexican hand who helped with the cattle and had an almost supernatural way with horses. Luis would be useful with these Colts, Jackson reflected. The boy had patience that belied his 18 years and an instinctive understanding of equine psychology that couldn't be taught. A soft whimper from the wagon drew Jackson's attention. The smaller Colt had laid down, his breathing labored in the heat. Jackson reined in his horse and climbed down, concern etching deeper lines into his weathered face. He dampened his bandana and gently wiped the Colt's muzzle and eyes, speaking softly all the while. "Hang on there, little one. Not much farther now. The larger Colt watched this interaction with intelligent eyes, snorting softly but making no move to interfere. Perhaps he understood that Jackson meant no harm, or maybe he was simply too exhausted to maintain his protective stance. After ensuring the smaller Colt was as comfortable as possible, Jackson continued their journey, now pushing his horse to a slightly faster pace while still being mindful of the precious cargo. Time was becoming a factor. The Colts needed proper care, and daylight was waning. About 5 miles from home, Jackson spotted a dust cloud approaching from the east. He tensed, one hand moving instinctively to the rifle secured beside the wagon seat. Strangers on the open range were never a neutral occurrence. As the rider drew closer, however, Jackson relaxed slightly. He recognized the pinto mare and the slight figure astride it. "Mr. Hargrove," Luis called as he approached, reining his horse alongside the wagon. "We were getting worried. Martha sent me to—" The young man's words died as he noticed the cargo in the wagon bed. His dark eyes widened, taking in the Colt's condition. "Dios mío, what happened to them?" "Former owner was a no-good gambler who left town," Jackson replied, not slowing the wagon. "These two were collateral damage." Luis's expression darkened. He had a soft spot for all animals, but especially horses. "They are very bad, no? Will they live?" "Don't know," Jackson admitted, "but they deserve a fighting chance." Luis nodded, falling in beside the wagon as they continued toward Broken Spoke. "I will help. My grandmother knew remedies for horses, special teas, poultices." Jackson didn't dismiss the offer. In his 30 years on the frontier, he'd seen enough indigenous and Mexican healing practices work when conventional methods failed. "We'll try whatever might help. First order is getting some nutrition into them without shocking their systems." "Thin gruel with molasses," Luis suggested. "And Martha made bone broth yesterday." "Good thinking." They crested a small rise and Broken Spoke came into view below them. It wasn't an impressive sight by Eastern standards. A main house built of rough-hewn logs with a stone foundation, a barn that leaned slightly to the west after last year's windstorm, corrals, a bunkhouse that currently housed only Luis, and various outbuildings scattered in a rough semicircle. But to Jackson, it represented everything he valued: independence, security, a place where he answered to no one. The setting sun cast long shadows across the property, gilding the weathered structures with a warm light that belied their humble appearance. Smoke rose from the main house chimney. Martha was still there, likely preparing dinner and muttering about his late return. As they approached the barn, Luis rode ahead to prepare a space for the Colts. Jackson guided the wagon into the central yard, noting with satisfaction that Luis had already opened the barn doors and was arranging clean straw in an empty stall. Martha emerged from the house, wiping her hands on her apron. Her weathered face registered surprise, then concern, as she caught sight of the wagon's contents. "Jackson Hargrove, what in heaven's name have you done now?" she demanded, approaching with surprising speed for a woman of her years. "Auction in town," he replied simply, bringing the wagon to a halt. Martha peered into the wagon bed, her expression softening as she took in the Colt's condition. "Poor creatures, they're nothing but skin and bones." "That's why they're here." She gave him a knowing look. For all his gruff exterior, Martha had long suspected that Jackson's heart was softer than he cared to admit. "I'll heat some broth and mix it with oats. Thin like for a sick child." Jackson nodded gratefully. "Thanks, Martha." Getting the Colts from the wagon into the barn presented a new challenge. The smaller one tried to stand but collapsed, his legs too weak to support even his diminished weight. The larger one managed to rise but swayed dangerously. "We'll need to carry the little one," Jackson said, climbing into the wagon. With Luis's help, he carefully lifted the smaller Colt, cradling him against his chest like an oversized foal. The animal weighed far less than he should have, making Jackson's jaw tighten with renewed anger at the neglect these creatures had suffered. The larger colt grew agitated at the separation, attempting to follow despite his weakness. Luis spoke softly in Spanish, guiding him with gentle touches rather than pulling on the makeshift halter. Somehow, the young man managed to convey enough reassurance that the protective colt followed his brother without resistance. Inside the barn, Jackson laid the smaller colt on the fresh straw Luis had prepared. The larger one immediately collapsed beside him, positioning himself so their bodies touched, maintaining the connection that had clearly sustained them through their ordeal. Jackson stepped back, watching as Luis checked them over more thoroughly, with the practiced hands of someone who understood horses on an instinctive level. The young man's expression grew increasingly grim as he cataloged the signs of neglect. Ribs like barrel staves beneath dull coats, sores where bones pressed against skin, hooves in desperate need of trimming and care. "It will be a long recovery, Patron," Luis said finally, looking up at Jackson. "If they survive at all." Jackson met his gaze steadily. "Then we'd better get started." Martha appeared in the barn doorway, carrying a steaming bucket and a ladle. "Broth's ready. Got some of that liniment too for their sores." As the three of them set about the task of saving the colts, Jackson reflected on the unexpected turn his day had taken. He'd gone to town for supplies and returned with 2 half-dead horses, and if Sheriff Mills was right, the unwanted attention of the railroad company. Life on the frontier had taught him that plans rarely survived contact with reality. All a man could do was face each challenge as it came and hold true to the principles that guided him. For Jackson Hargrove, that meant standing firm against those who would take what wasn't theirs, whether land, water rights, or the lives of 2 innocent creatures who deserved better than they'd received. Night fell over Broken Spoke Ranch, bringing a chill that penetrated the barn despite its solid construction. Jackson sat on an upturned bucket beside the stall, watching as the colts dozed fitfully. The smaller one's breathing still concerned him. Too shallow, occasionally labored. The larger one hadn't moved from his protective position, even when offered food. Luis had fashioned small compresses of herbs, soaked in warm water, placing them on the worst of the sores. Martha's bone broth, mixed with a small amount of oats and molasses, sat largely untouched beside them. The larger colt had taken a few tentative licks but seemed unwilling to eat, while his brother remained too weak to reach the bowl. "You should get some rest," Martha said, appearing in the barn doorway with a steaming cup of coffee. "Luis and I can take turns watching them tonight." Jackson accepted the cup but shook his head. "I'll stay. They need to get used to my presence." Martha studied him with knowing eyes. At 65, she'd seen enough of life to recognize when argument was futile. "Suit yourself. There's stew on the stove when you get hungry." After she departed, Jackson settled in for the night, pulling his coat tighter against the chill. The barn's familiar scents, hay, leather, horse, and the earthy smell of well-used tools, had always brought him comfort. Tonight, they mingled with the sharp tang of Martha's liniment and the unmistakable odor of animals close to death. "You two picked a hard road," he murmured, more to fill the silence than anything else, "but you're not alone on it anymore." The smaller colt's ear twitched at the sound of his voice. Jackson continued talking, his normally reserved nature giving way to a steady stream of quiet conversation. He told them about Broken Spoke, how he'd named it after finding a broken wagon wheel on the property when he first arrived. He described the spring that never ran dry, even in the worst drought years, and the north pasture where the grass grew sweet and tall. As he spoke, the larger colt's eyes drifted closed, though Jackson suspected he wasn't truly sleeping, just resting while maintaining his vigilance. The smaller one seemed to rally slightly, his breathing becoming marginally more regular. Around midnight, the barn door creaked open and Luis slipped inside, carrying a small clay pot. "Could not sleep," he explained simply, kneeling beside the Colts. "My grandmother's remedy, for strength." He opened the pot, revealing a thick, dark paste that smelled strongly of herbs and honey. With gentle fingers, he applied a small amount to the gums of the smaller colt, who initially resisted but then licked his lips, apparently finding the taste acceptable. Jackson watched without comment. He'd learned years ago not to dismiss traditional methods simply because they differed from his own knowledge. The frontier demanded adaptability and open-mindedness from those who wished to survive it. "What's in that?" he asked finally, curiosity overcoming his usual reticence. "Herbs from the hills, honey, crushed mesquite beans, and—" Luis hesitated, glancing at Jackson with a hint of uncertainty. "Some things my grandmother did not tell me. Family secrets." Jackson nodded, accepting the explanation. Every family had its private knowledge, passed down through generations. His own father had known how to predict storms with uncanny accuracy, a skill he'd tried but failed to teach his son before consumption took him. As Luis worked, Jackson noticed the smaller colt seemed to respond, his eyes brightening slightly as though the mixture provided some immediate strength. The larger one observed this change, then surprised them both by nudging the bowl of broth and oats toward his brother. "He wants him to eat," Luis said softly, wonder evident in his voice. "I have never seen such devotion," Jackson supplied, watching as the smaller colt made a more determined effort to reach the food. "They've only had each other. Creates a bond stronger than blood sometimes." When the smaller colt managed to take a few proper swallows of the mixture, Jackson felt something tight in his chest loosen slightly. It was far too early for certainty, but that small act of determination kindled a spark of hope. The night deepened around them, conversation lapsing into comfortable silence. Luis dozed against the barn wall while Jackson maintained his vigil, occasionally refreshing the water bucket or adjusting the blanket that covered the colts. Near dawn, the smaller colt's condition suddenly worsened. His breathing became more labored, each inhalation a visible struggle that racked his emaciated frame. Jackson was on his feet immediately, the movement waking Luis. "He's failing," Jackson said tersely, moving into the stall. "Help me get him upright. Might ease his breathing." Together, they carefully positioned the colt so his chest could expand more freely, Jackson supporting most of the weight while Luis prepared another dose of his grandmother's remedy. The larger colt grew agitated, rising on trembling legs and nearly toppling over in his distress. "Easy, big one," Jackson murmured. "We're trying to help." Whether the colt understood the words or simply responded to Jackson's tone, he calmed somewhat, though he remained standing, watching their every move with intelligent, worried eyes. For nearly an hour, they fought to keep the smaller colt breathing, administering tiny amounts of water and remedy, massaging his chest and talking constantly to both animals. Jackson found himself making promises he had no business making, that they would recover, that spring would bring green grass and freedom to run, that no one would ever mistreat them again. As the first pale light of dawn filtered through the barn windows, the smaller colt's breathing finally eased. His eyes, though still dulled by weakness, seemed more focused as they met Jackson's gaze. "That's it," Jackson encouraged, genuine relief evident in his voice. "Keep fighting." Martha arrived with breakfast and fresh coffee, taking in the scene with experienced eyes. "Been a rough night, I see." Jackson nodded, accepting a tin cup of coffee without moving from his position supporting the colt. "Touch and go, but he's hanging on." "Stubborn like someone else I know," Martha remarked, setting down a basket covered with a checkered cloth. "Biscuits and bacon, eat something, both of you. Can't help these creatures if you collapse yourselves." As they ate, Jackson found himself studying the Colts with growing attachment. Against all odds, they had survived the night. Whether that resilience would translate to long-term survival remained to be seen, but he was increasingly determined to give them every possible chance. "They need names," Luis said suddenly, voicing the thought that had been forming in Jackson's mind. For strength, for identity. Jackson considered this. He had never been one for sentimentality, preferring practical designations for ranch animals. But these Colts were different. They had fought too hard, endured too much to be reduced to mere functional labels. "The big one," he said after a moment. "We'll call him Sentinel, always watching over his brother." Luis nodded approvingly. "And the small one?" Jackson watched as the smaller Colt, still supported partially by his hands, turned his head to press against his brother's neck, seeking comfort, offering reassurance, perhaps both. Survivor, Jackson decided, because that's what he is, what they both are. 3 days passed in a rhythm of cautious hope and persistent worry. Survivor had rallied somewhat, now able to stand for short periods and taking small but regular amounts of the broth and grain mixture Martha prepared. Sentinel had finally begun eating properly once his brother showed improvement, though he remained vigilant, his dark eyes tracking every movement when anyone approached their stall. Jackson divided his time between caring for the Colts and tending to his regular ranch duties. Cattle still needed moving, fences required mending, and the 100 other tasks of running a working ranch couldn't be neglected. Yet he found himself returning to the barn at every opportunity, checking on the Colts' progress, speaking to them in the quiet, steady voice that seemed to calm them. On the morning of the 4th day, Jackson was repairing a broken corral post when Luis rode in from the east pasture, pushing his pinto harder than usual. "Riders coming," the young man reported, reining in beside Jackson. 3 men in fancy clothes. One has the railroad company pin on his coat. Jackson straightened, driving the last nail with a single powerful blow. "How far out?" "Maybe 15 minutes. They are taking their time, looking at everything." "Surveying," Jackson muttered, setting down his hammer. "Get back to the cattle, Luis. No need for you to be involved in this." The young man hesitated. "Perhaps I should stay, patron. Sometimes numbers help in negotiations." Jackson appreciated the loyalty, but shook his head. "This isn't a negotiation. Whatever they're selling, I'm not buying. Better you're not here for it." After Luis reluctantly departed, Jackson went to the water pump, washing trail dust from his face and hands. He didn't bother changing his worn work shirt or dusty trousers. Let them see him as he was, a working rancher, not someone trying to impress Eastern moneymen. He was checking on the Colts when he heard hoofbeats approaching. Sentinel and Survivor sensed his tension, the larger Colt rising unsteadily to his feet, while the smaller one watched with wary eyes. "Just some unwelcome visitors," Jackson told them quietly. "Nothing for you to worry about." He stepped out of the barn just as 3 riders entered the main yard. Their mounts were quality stock, Eastern thoroughbreds rather than sturdier Western breeds, and their clothing spoke of wealth and city living. The man in front wore a tailored suit despite the practical challenges of riding in such attire, his hat cleaner and more expensive than anything sold in Cottonwood Springs. "Mr. Hargrove?" the man called, dismounting with the awkward movements of someone unaccustomed to horses. "Cyrus Whitfield, Northern Westland Railway." He extended a hand that Jackson deliberately ignored. "You're trespassing," Jackson said flatly. "This is private property." Whitfield's smile tightened, his hand dropping to his side. "Apologies for arriving unannounced. Sheriff Mills mentioned you might be particular about visitors." "Sheriff Mills talks too much. State your business and then leave." The railroad man gestured to his companions, who remained mounted. These gentlemen represent our investors. We're conducting a survey of potential routes for the new rail line. The Carlton property we acquired provides part of what we need, but our engineers say the most efficient path would require a small portion of your land as well. Not interested, Jackson replied immediately. Your efficient path can go around my property. Whitfield adopted a reasonable tone that set Jackson's teeth on edge. Perhaps we could discuss this over a drink. We're prepared to make a very generous offer. No, you haven't even heard. Don't need to. Jackson crossed his arms, his stance unyielding. This land isn't for sale. Not a corner, not an acre, not all of it. Not to you, not to anyone. The pleasant mask slipped from Whitfield's face, revealing the calculating businessman beneath. Mr. Hargrove, the railway is coming through this territory whether individual ranchers approve or not. Progress can't be stopped. Those who cooperate will benefit. Those who resist will find themselves increasingly isolated. The threat, though subtle, was unmistakable. Jackson had heard similar warnings during the war, usually before small towns were burned and civilians displaced in the name of military necessity. My grandfather fought the British to own this country, Jackson said, his voice dangerously quiet. My father crossed half a continent in a wagon to claim his piece of it. I bled at Antietam and Gettysburg defending the idea that a man's rights matter. So when I say this land isn't for sale, I'm not starting a negotiation. I'm ending one. Whitfield studied him for a long moment, reassessing the weathered rancher before him. You're making a mistake, Hargrove. The railroad brings prosperity to those who embrace it, and ruin to those who stand in its way. Wouldn't be the first time someone thought they could ruin me. Jackson smiled without warmth. Didn't take the first time, won't take now. A soft nickering from the barn doorway drew everyone's attention. Sentinel stood there unsteadily, his dark eyes fixed on the strangers. Despite his emaciated condition, there was something commanding about his presence, a dignity that transcended his physical weakness. One of your new acquisitions? Whitfield asked, glancing at the Colt dismissively. Hardly seems worth the feed it would take to restore it. Some things have value beyond their appearance, Jackson replied. Not that I'd expect a railroad man to understand that. Whitfield's jaw tightened. We'll be in town for another week should you reconsider. After that, matters become more complicated. He remounted his horse with effort, clearly relieved to be concluding the confrontation. Good day, Mr. Hargrove. Jackson watched silently as the three men rode away, noting how they paused to study his water source and the lay of his grazing land. Only when they disappeared from view did he turn to Sentinel, who still stood in the barn doorway. You shouldn't be up so long, he chided gently, approaching the Colt. You'll tire yourself out. Sentinel allowed Jackson to guide him back to the stall, where Survivor greeted his brother with a soft nuzzle. As Jackson checked their water and feed, he found himself reflecting on Whitfield's thinly veiled threats. During the war, he had seen what happened when powerful interests decided that certain people's rights were expendable. He had watched farms and homes burned, families displaced, lives destroyed, all in service to someone else's definition of progress or necessity. He had vowed then that if he survived, he would create something no one could take from him. Broken Spoke wasn't just land and buildings to Jackson Hargrove. It represented a promise he'd made to himself while lying wounded at Cold Harbor, certain he would die before sunrise. If he lived, he would build something lasting, something that belonged only to him, something no one could burn or steal or destroy in the name of a cause greater than individual liberty. They'll be back, he told the Colts, stroking Sentinel's neck. Men like that don't hear no very well, but they'll learn. Survivor had managed to stand as well, wobbling over to investigate Jackson's boots with cautious curiosity. It was the first time the smaller Colt had approached him voluntarily, a small gesture of trust that felt disproportionately significant. Jackson crouched down, allowing Survivor to sniff his outstretched hand. That's right. Nothing to fear here. When the Colt permitted a gentle touch to his muzzle, Jackson felt a fierce protectiveness surge through him. These animals had survived neglect and cruelty, only to face the long, difficult road to recovery. They deserved a chance, the same chance he had fought for on blood-soaked battlefields and claimed for himself in this remote corner of the frontier. "We're all survivors here," he murmured, including himself in the assessment for the first time, "and survivors stand their ground." Martha was waiting on the porch when Jackson returned from seeing off his unwelcome visitors, her arms crossed and her expression grim. "I saw them railroad men," she said without preamble. "Nothing good comes from suits on horseback." Jackson climbed the steps, his boots heavy on the weathered wood. "They want part of the ranch for their rail line." "And you told them to go to hell, I expect." "Not in those exact words," Jackson replied, the ghost of a smile touching his lips. "But the meaning was clear enough." Martha nodded approvingly, then glanced toward the barn where the Colts were housed. "How are our patients today?" "Better." Survivor approached me on his own. Jackson couldn't quite keep the pride from his voice. "First time he's done that." "Those two have good instincts," Martha observed. "They know who saved them." Over the next week, the Colts' improvement continued, albeit slowly. Survivor gained enough strength to stand for longer periods while Sentinel began exploring the stall more confidently, sometimes even approaching the half door to observe ranch activities. Luis spent hours with them, speaking softly in Spanish and English, occasionally singing songs his grandmother had taught him. The Colts seemed to respond to the music, their ears pricking forward attentively. Jackson maintained his regular routine, but found his thoughts frequently returning to the railroad men's visit. He wasn't naive enough to believe they would simply accept his refusal and leave him in peace. Men like Cyrus Whitfield were accustomed to getting their way, one way or another. His concerns proved well-founded when Luis returned from town with troubling news. The young man had gone to purchase supplies and overheard conversations at the mercantile. "They are talking to everyone, Patron," Luis reported as they worked together in the corral, training one of the younger ranch horses. "Offering jobs, promising prosperity when the railroad comes, making big plans as if it is already decided." Jackson adjusted the saddle blanket before responding. "Not surprising. It's an old tactic, create a sense of inevitability. Some people are excited. Mr. Peterson at the freight company, he thinks his business will grow. The Wilsons want to open a hotel for travelers." "And some?" Luis shrugged. "The Caldwells worry about their grazing rights near town. Old Jim Baker says railroads bring too many people, too fast, but most see only money, opportunity." Jackson nodded, processing this information as he checked the cinch on the saddle. The railroad men were smart, targeting the town first, building support, isolating potential opposition. It was a strategy he'd seen during the war, dividing communities until resistance became socially costly. "There is more," Luis added hesitantly. "They ask many questions about you, about the ranch, the water rights, even about the Colts." Jackson's hands stilled on the leather straps. "The Colts? What interest would they have in two half-dead yearlings?" "I do not know, Patron. But Mr. Whitfield, he asked specifically if they were recovering, if they would survive." A cold feeling settled in Jackson's gut. There was no logical reason for Whitfield to concern himself with the Colts, unless... "Did you hear anything about Wilson, the gambler who owned them before?" Luis nodded. "That is why I thought it strange. Someone said Wilson worked for the railroad sometimes, doing things they did not want their regular men involved in." The pieces clicked together in Jackson's mind with disturbing clarity. Wilson hadn't just been a gambler who neglected his animals. He'd been working for the railroad, perhaps gathering information or performing other questionable services. The Colts weren't just abandoned property. They were a connection to something the railroad wanted buried. That evening, Jackson found himself examining the Colts more carefully, looking for anything unusual. On the surface, they appeared to be ordinary yearlings, albeit severely undernourished. Yet something about Sentinel's watchful intelligence and Survivor's unexpected resilience suggested they were not common stock. "What's your story?" he murmured, running a gentle hand along Sentinel's bony withers. "What makes you worth asking after?" The Colt offered no answers, but pressed into Jackson's touch with growing trust. Their coats had begun to improve with proper nutrition and care, revealing hints of the glossy black they would become when fully recovered. Survivor's breathing had strengthened, and he no longer struggled to stand, though prolonged movement still exhausted him. 2 days later, Sheriff Mills rode out to Broken Spoke, ostensibly to check on the Colt's progress. Jackson received him in the yard, offering coffee but no invitation to enter the house. "They're improving," Jackson said in response to Mills's inquiry. "Still got a long way to go." Mills nodded, sipping his coffee while studying the ranch with too casual interest. "Heard you had a visit from the railroad men." "News travels fast." "Small community," Mills replied with a shrug. "Also heard you weren't exactly welcoming." Jackson met his gaze steadily. "They want my land. I'm not selling." "Nobody's asking you to sell the whole ranch, Jackson. Just a narrow strip for the tracks. Might be wise to consider it. Railroad's going to change everything around here, bring prosperity, growth." "Didn't know you were their spokesman, Tom." Mills had the grace to look uncomfortable. "Not speaking for them, just being practical. Progress is coming whether we like it or not." "That's what they keep saying." Jackson took a slow sip of his own coffee. "Funny thing about progress, seems to benefit some folks a whole lot more than others." The sheriff set down his cup, abandoning pretense. "Look, Whitfield's been asking about you, about the ranch, water rights, even those Colts you bought. There's talk of eminent domain if you won't cooperate." "Let them try," Jackson replied quietly. "This isn't the first time someone's tried to take what's mine." Mills studied him, recognition dawning in his eyes. "This isn't the war, Jackson. You're not facing an enemy army." "Aren't I?" Jackson gestured toward the town. "Divide the community, isolate the opposition, create the impression that resistance is futile. Sounds familiar enough to me." The sheriff sighed. "I'm just trying to help you avoid trouble." "Appreciate the thought. But sometimes trouble needs to be faced, not avoided." After Mills departed, Jackson went to check on the Colts, finding Luis already there, brushing Sentinel's coat with slow, gentle strokes. The young man had fashioned a softer brush for the task, mindful of the Colt's sensitive skin where bones still pressed too close to the surface. "Sheriff brought news?" Luis asked, noting Jackson's expression. "Railroad's not giving up. They're talking about eminent domain now." Luis frowned. "What is this eminent domain?" "Legal theft," Jackson replied bitterly. "Government can force you to sell your land if they decide it's for the public good. Railroad's got enough politicians in their pocket to make that argument. Can they really take your land?" Jackson watched as Survivor approached cautiously, drawn by the conversation. The smaller Colt had developed a surprising curiosity, often listening intently when humans spoke nearby. "They can try," Jackson said finally. "But I learned something during the war, Luis. Even when you're outgunned and outnumbered, the person defending their home always has one advantage." "What is that, Patron?" Jackson reached out, gently touching Survivor's nose, when the Colt extended it toward him, a gesture of trust that would have been unthinkable just days ago. "They're fighting for profit. We're fighting for something that matters." 2 weeks after the Colts' arrival at Broken Spoke, Jackson found cause for cautious optimism. Survivor could now stand and walk for extended periods, his breathing no longer labored. Sentinel had filled out enough that his ribs, while still visible, no longer threatened to pierce his skin. Their eyes had brightened, and their coats, though still dull, showed patches of improvement where new growth replaced neglected hair. Luis had constructed a small paddock adjoining the barn, where the Colts could enjoy fresh air and sunshine without the freedom to wander far or exhaust themselves. Jackson watched from the corral fence as they explored this new space, Sentinel always positioning himself between his brother and any perceived threat. "They're starting to look like proper horses," Martha observed, joining him at the fence. "That smaller one's got a mind of his own, doesn't he?" Jackson nodded, observing how Survivor investigated everything within reach, his curiosity seemingly boundless now that his strength was returning. "Reminds me of my brother Joseph, always poking into things, asking questions." It was a rare personal reference. Jackson seldom spoke of his family or past, maintaining a privacy that most frontier folk respected. Martha, recognizing the significance, merely nodded. "Never knew you had a brother." "Died at Fredericksburg." Jackson's voice was matter-of-fact, though his eyes remained fixed on the Colts. "He was 19. Martha understood that the brief disclosure was both gift and boundary. She changed the subject, gesturing toward the road that connected Broken Spoke to town. "Luis says there's been strangers asking about the ranch, men who don't look like cowboys or settlers." "Railroad's still trying to build their case," Jackson replied. "Pressure, persuasion, then force if necessary." "You think it'll come to that?" Before Jackson could answer, Luis rode in from the north pasture, pushing his pinto harder than usual. The young man's expression was troubled as he dismounted. "Patron, there are men at the north fence line. They have surveying equipment, making measurements and placing stakes." Jackson's jaw tightened. "On my land?" "See, just inside the boundary. I told them they were trespassing, but they showed papers. Said they have permission from the territorial office to conduct preliminary surveys." It was a blatant escalation. Without waiting for permission or negotiation, the railroad was proceeding as if their claim to his land was already settled. Jackson checked that his revolver was secured at his hip, then strode toward the barn to saddle his horse. Martha and Luis exchanged worried glances before the young man hurried after his employer. "I will come with you." Jackson paused, considering. Having a witness might be prudent, given the railroad's apparent willingness to manipulate legal systems. "All right, but follow my lead." As they prepared to leave, a commotion from the paddock drew their attention. The Colts were agitated, Sentinel particularly so, his ears pinned back as he paced the fence line facing north, the same direction from which the surveyors had come. "He senses something wrong," Luis observed. "Horses know." Jackson studied the Colt's behavior, noting how precisely Sentinel oriented himself toward the north boundary. It seemed more specific than general anxiety. "Keep an eye on them while I'm gone," he instructed Martha. "Anything unusual, bring them back inside the barn." The ride to the north fence line took 20 minutes at a steady trot. As they approached, Jackson spotted 3 men with surveying equipment, placing wooden stakes with small flags along what would presumably become the railway's path through his property. "Gentlemen," he called, his voice carrying the quiet authority that had once commanded men in battle, "you're trespassing on private land." The surveyors looked up, unsurprised by his arrival. The oldest, a bearded man with spectacles, produced a document from his coat pocket. "We have authorization from the Territorial Commissioner to conduct preliminary surveys on all lands potentially affected by the proposed railway route," he stated with rehearsed precision. Jackson dismounted, taking the paper and examining it carefully. The document appeared official, complete with territorial seal and commissioner's signature. Whether it was legitimate or another of Whitfield's manipulations remained to be seen. "This paper doesn't override property rights," Jackson replied, returning the document. "Remove your stakes and equipment from my land immediately." The surveyor's expression remained neutral. "I understand your concern, Mr. Hargrove. However, this is merely a preliminary assessment. No construction will begin without proper negotiation and compensation." "No construction will begin at all," Jackson corrected. "Now pack up and leave." The youngest surveyor, who had remained silent until now, stepped forward. "Sir, we're just doing our job. The railroad is coming through these parts one way or another." "Not through my land, it isn't." Jackson's hand rested casually near his revolver, not a threat, but a reminder. The bearded surveyor sighed, then nodded to his companions. "We've marked enough points for today. We'll return another time to complete the survey." As the men gathered their equipment, Jackson noticed something that made his blood run cold. The youngest surveyor wore a distinctive belt buckle, a silver design featuring a pair of crossed pistols that Jackson had seen before on Wilson, the gambler who had owned the Colts. "That buckle," Jackson said, causing the young man to look up nervously. "Unusual design. Mind if I ask where you got it?" The surveyor's hand moved instinctively to cover the item. "Family heirloom. Nothing special." "Interesting. Man named Wilson had one just like it. Gambler who mistreated 2 Colts I recently acquired." The surveyor's expression flickered with recognition before he could control it. The bearded man interceded quickly. "We should be going. Good day, Mr. Hargrove." Jackson and Luis watched as the surveyors departed, taking a route that would return them to town rather than continuing along Jackson's property line. "They know something about Wilson," Luis observed once the men were out of earshot, "and about the Colts." "Yes," Jackson agreed. "Question is, what?" That evening, as Jackson checked on the Colts before retiring, he noticed Sentinel behaving oddly again, pacing restlessly, ears pricked forward, nostrils flared as he faced north. It was the same direction where they'd encountered the surveyors, the same alert posture the Colt had displayed earlier. "What is it you know?" Jackson murmured, stroking the Colt's neck. "What happened to you out there?" Sentinel turned his intelligent gaze to Jackson, then resumed his vigilant stance. Something about the Colt's behavior stirred Jackson's instincts, the same instincts that had kept him alive through the war when others fell. The railroad's interest in these particular Colts wasn't coincidental. The next morning, Jackson rode into town alone, determined to uncover whatever connection existed between Wilson, the railroad, and his 2 rescued Colts. His first stop was the sheriff's office, where he found Mills cleaning his rifle. "Need to ask about Wilson," Jackson said without preamble, "the gambler who owned those Colts." Mills set aside his cleaning cloth. "What about him? What was his connection to the railroad?" The sheriff's expression remained carefully neutral. "What makes you think there was one?" "Don't waste my time, Tom. Railroad men are too interested in those Colts for it to be coincidence." Mills considered Jackson for a long moment before responding. "Wilson wasn't just a gambler. He was a scout for the railroad, exploring potential routes, assessing land before the official surveyors arrived. And about 3 months ago, he returned from a scouting trip north of your property, acting strange, started drinking heavily, gambling away everything he had. Then he disappeared overnight, leaving those Colts behind." Jackson leaned forward, his weathered hands flat on the sheriff's desk. "What did Wilson find north of my land, Tom?" The sheriff shrugged, but his eyes betrayed discomfort. "Nobody knows for certain. He wasn't much for talking, especially sober." "But you have suspicions." Mills sighed, glancing toward the door to ensure they were alone. "There were rumors. Wilson got drunk at Peterson's one night, started rambling about black gold and how he'd be rich enough to leave this territory forever." "Oil?" Jackson straightened, the pieces beginning to fall into place. Maybe, or coal, something valuable enough that he thought he could extort the railroad with the knowledge. Mills lowered his voice. Whatever it was, he took those Colts with him on that last scouting trip. They were in fine condition when he left. Prime stock, actually. Something happened out there that nearly killed those animals and sent Wilson running. Jackson processed this information, his mind racing. Running from what? Or who? Mills countered. 2 days after Wilson disappeared, men came looking for him. Not regular railroad men, hard cases, the kind who solve problems permanently. This explained the railroad's unusual interest in 2 seemingly worthless Colts. They weren't after the animals themselves, but what they might have witnessed or where they might lead. "Those Colts know something," Jackson murmured, almost to himself. "Horses don't talk, Jackson." "No, but they remember. Sentinel, the larger one, he keeps facing north, getting agitated." Jackson met the sheriff's gaze. "He's trying to tell me something." Mills shook his head. "You're reading too much into animal behavior. The railroad wants your water rights and the direct route through your property, that's all." "Then why ask specifically about the Colts?" Jackson countered. "Why send surveyors to the north boundary first, instead of the more direct route from town?" The sheriff had no answer for that. Back at Broken Spoke, Jackson found Luis exercising the Colts in the paddock, leading them in gentle circles to build their strength without overtaxing them. Their improvement was remarkable, not just physical recovery but growing trust. Survivor even accepted a halter now, though he still startled at sudden movements. "Any visitors while I was gone?" Jackson asked, dismounting. Luis shook his head. "Quiet day. Sentinel was uneasy earlier, facing north again." He hesitated before adding, "I rode along the north fence after feeding them. Found fresh tracks beyond our boundary, several horses moving parallel to our property line." Jackson's expression hardened. "How far did you follow them?" "Not far, Patron. They continued toward the hills." Luis nodded toward the distant northern ridge that marked the edge of Jackson's grazing territory. "I did not like being watched." "Watched?" "See, the feeling of eyes, like being tracked by a mountain lion." The young man crossed himself reflexively. "Bad feeling." Jackson considered this information while watching the Colts. Sentinel had stopped his exercise and was once again oriented northward, his posture alert rather than anxious. He wasn't afraid of whatever lay in that direction. He was drawn to it. "Tomorrow we ride north," Jackson decided. "See what's got everyone so interested in that worthless rocky ground." That evening, Martha served a hearty stew while providing her own intelligence gathered during her weekly visit to town. The railroad company had opened an office in the former dry goods store, displaying maps of the proposed route and promising economic prosperity to all who supported the project. "They're offering jobs already," she reported. "Construction, maintenance, station operations, half the town's ready to sign contracts." "Contracts for work that can't begin until they secure the route," Jackson noted. "They're building leverage, making the community dependent on their promises." "Getting folks invested," Martha agreed. "Harder for people to oppose something when their livelihoods depend on it." Jackson nodded, recognizing the strategy. Create enough economic dependency, and the community itself would pressure holdouts like him. If that failed, the territorial government, always eager for development and tax revenue, would invoke eminent domain with local support. It was a well-executed campaign, one that made his solitary resistance seem selfish and backward rather than principled. "There's talk about you in town," Martha continued reluctantly. "Some calling you a stubborn old war relic, standing in the way of progress." "Let them talk." Jackson's voice held no anger, just resignation. He'd never sought popularity, only the freedom to live on his own terms. At dawn, Jackson and Luis prepared for their expedition north. They packed provisions for a full day's ride, along with Jackson's old Army field glasses and rifles. The north section of Broken Spoke was rugged terrain, rocky hills and narrow ravines, useful mainly for occasional grazing during wet years. Before departing, Jackson checked on the Colts. Both were awake early, watching him with interest as he approached their stall. On impulse, he unlatched the gate and led them to the paddock. "We're going to find out what you know," he told Sentinel, stroking the colt's muscular neck. "See what's got you so fixated on the North Country." The colt's ears pricked forward at his words, and Jackson could have sworn there was understanding in those dark eyes. Beside him, Survivor pressed close to his brother, their bond undiminished by their improving health and growing independence. Martha emerged from the house, a wrapped package in her hands. "Food for your journey," she explained, handing it to Luis, "and something for those colts while you're gone." As Jackson and Luis mounted, Sentinel whinnied loudly, straining against the paddock fence in the direction they were headed. The sound wasn't distress, but something closer to urgency, as if the colt was trying to communicate something vital. "He wants to go with us," Luis observed. "He's not strong enough," Jackson replied, though he found himself wishing the colt could guide them more directly to whatever had caused his previous owner's fear. They rode north at a steady pace, following the natural rise of the land toward the rocky ridge that marked Jackson's property boundary. The morning was cool, the sun not yet high enough to burn away the lingering dawn chill. Perfect weather for covering ground. As they approached the boundary line, marked by a simple barbed wire fence installed years earlier, Jackson noted fresh hoofprints crossing his property. Confirmation of Luis's earlier observation. The tracks led toward a particularly rugged section of the ridge, an area so rocky and steep that Jackson rarely visited it. "There," Luis said, pointing to disturbed ground where someone had recently cleared brush and soil from a rocky outcropping. Someone was digging. Jackson dismounted to examine the site. The exposed rock face showed a dark seam running through the lighter stone. Coal, potentially valuable if the deposit was large enough. But this small outcropping hardly seemed worth the railroad's intense interest. "There must be more," he muttered, scanning the ridge with his field glasses. Further north, just beyond his property line, he spotted what appeared to be a small encampment, 3 tents and several horses picketed nearby. "Railroad survey team?" Luis asked, following his gaze. "Maybe, or something they don't want official surveyors to report." Jackson focused the glasses more carefully, noting that the men moving about the camp weren't dressed like surveyors. They wore practical frontier clothing, and all were visibly armed. "Guards," Jackson concluded, "protecting something." His instincts told him they'd found the answer to Sentinel's strange behavior and Wilson's abrupt departure. Whatever lay beyond that ridge had sent one man running in terror and brought others with guns and secrecy. And somehow, the Colts were connected to it all. Jackson studied the encampment through his field glasses, counting 5 armed men moving between tents. Their behavior suggested they were guards rather than surveyors or railroad officials, alert, watchful, positioned to observe approaches from all directions. "We need a closer look," he decided, lowering the glasses, "but not from here, too exposed." Luis nodded toward a ravine cutting through the rocky terrain to their east. That arroyo might lead behind their position. They would not expect anyone to come that way. It was sound reasoning. The ravine was narrow, difficult to navigate on horseback, but would provide cover for most of their approach. "We'll leave the horses here," Jackson decided. "Continue on foot." They secured their mounts in a small grove of scrub oak, leaving them with water and feed bags. The remainder of their approach would be slow and cautious, utilizing the natural cover provided by the rugged landscape. The ravine proved even more challenging than it appeared from a distance. Loose shale made footing treacherous, and twice they had to backtrack around sections too narrow to pass. The sun climbed higher, beating down on the exposed rock and making the air shimmer with heat. "Wilson brought those Colts through this country?" Luis whispered as they paused to drink from their canteens. "No wonder they nearly died." Jackson nodded grimly. The terrain was barely passable for experienced men, let alone horses, especially if Wilson had been fleeing in panic. That the Colts had survived it all spoke to their remarkable resilience. After nearly an hour of careful progress, they reached a position that offered a view of the encampment from behind. Here, the reason for the guards became immediately apparent. A narrow shaft had been dug into the hillside, reinforced with timber supports and equipped with basic mining equipment. Men emerged periodically, carrying buckets of material that they deposited on a growing pile nearby. "Not coal," Jackson murmured, observing the distinctive yellow gleam visible even at this distance. "Gold." Luis crossed himself. "Dios mío. Right at the edge of your land, Patron." The implications were staggering. If the gold vein extended onto Jackson's property, which seemed likely given the surveyor's focus on his northern boundary, the railroad's interest went far beyond a convenient route for tracks. They wanted the mineral rights, potentially worth far more than the land itself. As they watched, a familiar figure emerged from one of the tents, Cyrus Whitfield, the railroad representative. He spoke with the mine workers, examining samples they presented. His presence confirmed Jackson's suspicions. This operation was the railroad's true objective in the region. "They're keeping this quiet," Jackson observed. "No claim stakes, no filing with the territorial office, just armed men and secrecy." "Because they do not have rights to this land yet," Luis concluded. "If others knew about the gold, every prospector for 500 miles would descend on these hills," Jackson finished, "and the railroad would lose their chance to acquire it cheaply through their track right-of-way." The deception was clever. By presenting their interest as merely a railroad route, they could use eminent domain proceedings to acquire not just a narrow corridor, but potentially the mineral rights beneath it, all at a fraction of its true value. That's why Wilson ran, Jackson realized. He found the gold, tried to leverage it for more money, and they decided he was a liability. "And the Colts?" Luis asked. "Witnesses. They know this place, could lead others back here if someone figured out the connection." Jackson's jaw tightened. Probably thought they'd die from neglect after Wilson abandoned them. Their observation was interrupted by movement below. Two riders approached the camp from the west, men Jackson recognized from town as the hard cases Sheriff Mills had mentioned. They spoke briefly with Whitfield, who then pointed toward Broken Spoke Ranch. The men nodded and rode out again with purpose. A cold certainty settled in Jackson's gut. They're done negotiating. Those men are heading to the ranch. For what purpose, Patron? To ensure I can't interfere with their plans. Jackson began moving immediately, picking his way back down the ravine with urgency overriding caution. "We need to get back." The return journey was faster but more dangerous, both men risking loose footing and exposure in their haste. Jackson's mind raced with possibilities, none of them good. If the railroad had decided force was necessary, Martha and the Colts would be their first targets, removing both his reason to stay and the animals that could expose their secret. When they reached their horses, both men mounted quickly, urging their mounts to a gallop despite the treacherous terrain. Jackson felt time pressing against him like a physical weight, each moment stretching the distance between him and those under his protection. "We can cut through Miller's Canyon," Luis called, indicating a narrow pass that would shave precious minutes from their journey. "It is rough but passable." Jackson nodded, following as the young man led them into the shadow of the canyon walls. The route was indeed rough, a dry stream bed littered with boulders and fallen timber that forced their horses to pick their way carefully despite their riders' urgency. They were halfway through when Luis suddenly reined in his Pinto, raising a warning hand. Riders ahead. Jackson drew his rifle from its scabbard, scanning the route ahead. 3 mounted men had positioned themselves at the canyon's exit, effectively blocking the most direct route back to Broken Spoke. "Railroad men?" Luis whispered. Jackson recognized one of them as a guard from the mining camp. "Yes, they anticipated our return route." They backed their horses into the shadow of an overhanging rock, considering their options. The canyon offered only one exit ahead, now blocked by armed men. Returning the way they came would cost valuable time they couldn't afford. "We could try climbing out," Luis suggested, eyeing the steep canyon walls. "Too slow and we'd lose the horses." Jackson studied their surroundings, years of military experience informing his assessment. "We'll have to go through them." Luis's eyes widened. "They are armed, Patron." "So are we." Jackson checked his rifle, then his revolver. "And we have surprise and higher ground. They'll expect us to retreat when challenged, not charge directly at them." The young man nodded, understanding the strategy if not fully sharing Jackson's confidence. "What is your plan?" "When we're spotted, I'll provide covering fire. You ride hard for the exit. Once clear, circle back to the ranch as fast as you can. I'll be right behind you." Luis started to protest but recognized the logic. His younger, lighter mount could outpace Jackson's, and someone needed to reach Martha and the Colts quickly. They advanced slowly until they cleared the deepest shadows of the canyon, emerging into visibility about 200 yards from the waiting men. For a moment, it seemed they might pass unnoticed. Then a shout went up, and the 3 riders moved to form a more solid blockade. "Now!" Jackson commanded, raising his rifle and firing a shot that kicked up dirt near the leftmost rider. Luis spurred his Pinto forward, bent low over the saddle as Jackson provided covering fire, forcing the railroad men to seek their own cover rather than aim carefully. The distraction worked. The young ranch hand broke through their line and disappeared around the bend, riding hard for Broken Spoke. Jackson fired twice more, then urged his own mount forward, counting on the confusion to cover his escape. One of the railroad men recovered quickly enough to take aim, his shot whistling past Jackson's ear close enough that he felt the displacement of air. Returning fire with his revolver, Jackson broke through the blockade, but not without consequence. A sharp pain tore through his left shoulder as a bullet found its mark. The impact nearly unseated him, but years of riding through all conditions allowed him to maintain his position despite the shock and pain. Once clear of the canyon, Jackson pushed his horse to its limits, blood soaking his shirt, and the growing certainty that this confrontation had moved beyond property disputes into something far deadlier. The railroad had shown their hand. They would kill to protect their secret and secure their claim. Blood soaked Jackson's sleeve as he pushed his horse to its limits, every hoofbeat sending fresh pain through his wounded shoulder. The road to Broken Spoke stretched before him, the familiar landscape now a gauntlet he had to survive. He estimated Luis was 15 minutes ahead, hopefully enough time to warn Martha and secure the Colts before the railroad men arrived. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly as Jackson fought to stay upright in the saddle. His military experience told him the bullet had passed through muscle without hitting bone or major vessels. Painful, but not immediately life-threatening. Still, blood loss would eventually take its toll. Cresting the final ridge that overlooked his property, Jackson reined in briefly to assess the situation. Smoke rose from the main house chimney, suggesting Martha was still there. The barn door stood open, and with a surge of relief he spotted Luis leading the Colts toward the stone spring house, the sturdiest structure on the property and easiest to defend. As Jackson urged his mount down the slope, movement at the eastern approach caught his eye. 2 riders approached Broken Spoke from the direction of town, the men Whitfield had dispatched from the mining camp. They were still a mile out, but closing fast. Jackson cut across the pasture, taking the most direct route to the spring house. Luis spotted him and rushed to help as he dismounted, nearly collapsing as his boots hit the ground. "Patron, you're wounded." "Just a graze," Jackson lied, letting the young man support him toward the stone structure. "Where's Martha?" "Inside with supplies. I told her to prepare for trouble." Luis glanced at the approaching riders. "Those men, they are the same ones who watched us in the canyon?" "Different ones. Whitfield's casting a wide net." Jackson straightened with effort. "Get my rifle from the saddle and bring the Colts inside." The spring house was small but solidly built, its walls 2 feet thick to maintain cool temperatures year-round. A single window and narrow door made it defensible, while the natural spring that gave the structure its name provided water. Martha had already arranged supplies, ammunition, bandages, food, with the practical efficiency of a woman who had survived frontier life by anticipating trouble. "About time you showed up," she said, immediately cutting away Jackson's bloodied sleeve to examine the wound. "Luis said the railroad's playing for keeps now." "Gold," Jackson confirmed, wincing as she cleaned the bullet hole with whiskey. "They found it just north of our boundary, probably extends onto my land." Martha's hands never faltered as she applied pressure to slow the bleeding. "And those two heading this way? Sent to make sure I can't interfere with their plans." Outside, Luis struggled to coax the nervous Colts toward the spring house door. Sentinel balked, snorting and backing away despite Luis's gentle encouragement. "They won't come inside," the young man called, too afraid of being trapped. Jackson moved to the doorway, one arm now bandaged and bound against his chest. "Let them stay in the corral for now. Just get yourself in here." Luis secured the Colts in the small corral adjacent to the spring house, then joined Jackson and Martha inside. They barely had time to position themselves before the railroad men arrived, approaching cautiously with rifles ready. "Hargrove," one called, keeping his horse beyond easy rifle range. "We know you're in there. Mr. Whitfield wants a word with you in town." Jackson positioned himself at the window, his rifle resting on the sill. "Funny way to deliver an invitation," he called back. "Usually don't require guns." "Just a precaution. There's been reports of outlaws in these parts." "Only outlaws I see are trespassing on my land right now." The men exchanged glances, abandoning the pretense. "You've got 2 choices, Hargrove. Ride with us to town for a civilized discussion about selling your property, or things get uncivilized real quick." "Already got uncivilized when you put a bullet in my shoulder," Jackson replied calmly, "and when you tried to steal what's mine through lies about railroad routes." This revelation clearly surprised the men. Their momentary confusion confirmed what Jackson had suspected. These were hired guns who knew only part of Whitfield's plan. "We know about the gold," Jackson continued, pressing his advantage. "Know about your secret mine and the claim you're trying to steal. Sheriff Mills knows too by now." The second man spat on the ground. "Mills won't help you. He's on the railroad payroll just like half the town." "Maybe. But territorial marshals aren't, and they tend to take a dim view of claim jumping and attempted murder." The tension stretched taut between them, both sides aware that the next move would determine whether blood soaked the ground of Broken Spoke Ranch. Jackson kept his rifle steady despite the pain radiating from his shoulder, watching as the railroad men weighed their options. The standoff might have erupted into violence then, if not for a sudden commotion from the corral. Sentinel had broken through the gate, charging directly at the railroad men with unexpected speed and determination. Survivor followed closely behind, both Colts moving with a coordination that belied their still recovering condition. Startled by the sudden attack, the railroad men's horses reared in panic. One rider kept his seat, but the other tumbled to the ground, losing his rifle in the fall. Sentinel didn't stop, driving straight toward the dismounted man with ears pinned flat and teeth bared. The fallen gunman scrambled for his weapon, but Sentinel was faster, trampling the rifle before rearing above him with threatening hooves. The display was more intimidation than attack. The Colt didn't strike the cowering man, but held his position with unmistakable menace. Jackson seized the moment, moving from the spring house with his rifle trained on the still-mounted man. "Drop your gun," he commanded, "or my next shot won't be a warning." With his partner at the mercy of an unexpectedly aggressive Colt, the railroad man had little choice. He released his weapon, letting it fall to the dirt. "Tie them up," Jackson told Luis. "We're all taking a trip to town." The confrontation at Broken Spoke ended without further bloodshed, but its consequences reverberated far beyond the ranch boundaries. With evidence of the secret mining operation and witnesses to the railroad's tactics, Jackson forced a public reckoning that the railroad's money couldn't easily suppress. Territorial authorities, alerted by multiple telegrams from concerned citizens, dispatched investigators who discovered not only the illegal mining operation, but also documentation in Whitfield's office detailing the scheme to use eminent domain as cover for seizing mineral rights. 2 weeks later, Jackson sat on his porch, arms still bandaged but healing well, watching as Sentinel and Survivor explored the larger paddock he'd constructed for their continued rehabilitation. The Colts had transformed from the skeletal creatures he'd rescued at auction. Their black coats now gleamed with health, muscles developing beneath skin that no longer hung from protruding bones. Martha emerged from the house with coffee, settling into the chair beside him. "Paper says they've arrested Whitfield and 3 others. Railroad's denying any knowledge of their actions, claiming they were rogue employees." Jackson snorted. "Convenient. Also says the territorial office is reviewing all recent land acquisitions by the railroad." She sipped her coffee thoughtfully. "Including the Carlton place." "Too little, too late for some," Jackson observed, thinking of Wilson and others who had been forced from their land. They sat in companionable silence, watching the Colts run with increasing confidence. Sentinel still maintained his protective stance toward his smaller brother, but Survivor showed growing independence, often exploring ahead before returning to check on his companion. "Deputy Mills rode out this morning while you were checking the north pasture," Martha said eventually. "Brought news about the Colts." Jackson raised an eyebrow questioningly. "Turns out they're not just any horses. Their dam was thoroughbred stock brought west by some wealthy Easterner trying to establish a breeding program. Wilson stole them before they were weaned, planned to sell them once they matured." Jackson watched the Colts with new understanding. Their intelligence, resilience, and unusual bond made more sense knowing their lineage, quality blood that had helped them survive when lesser animals would have perished. "Territorial office says they're rightfully yours now," Martha continued. "Previous owner can't be found, and you've got proof of purchase from the auction." Jackson nodded, a rare smile touching his weathered features as Sentinel approached the porch, Survivor close behind. The larger Colt extended his nose toward Jackson's outstretched hand with the trust that had gradually replaced wariness. "I'll take them all," Jackson said softly, echoing his declaration at the auction that had set these events in motion. "Everything fate sends my way." The Colts had come to him starving and fearful, rescued on impulse by a solitary man who recognized something in their suffering that echoed his own past. In saving them, he had unwittingly saved his ranch, and perhaps himself, breaking through the isolation that had been both his comfort and his prison since the war. As the sun set over Broken Spoke Ranch, painting the sky in brilliant orange and gold, Jackson Hargrove sat surrounded by the family he had never sought but somehow found. 2 rescued Colts, a cantankerous housekeeper, a loyal young ranch hand, and the promise of days ahead filled with purpose beyond mere survival.